Welcome to the offices of the VSO. I'm Ashley Johnson.
And I'm Greg Scholl, trombonist in the Vancouver Symphony. Welcome to Da Capo.
So one of the pieces that's going to be performed this weekend happens to be a favorite of mine. It's Rimsky-Korsakov's Scheherazade, a beautiful piece of music.
That's right. This is not just your favorite. It's a lot of people's favorites. And I know several people who are interested in coming to this concert, even though they're not that excited about seeing me play in other orchestras.
So tell me a little bit about Rimsky-Korsakov.
Well, he has a very important place in Russian music. And without getting into the whole period, we can safely say that he is considered one of the five, and that's capital T, capital F. Mm-hmm. There's five composers from the era of Rimsky-Korsakov: Balakirev, Cesar Cui, Modest Mussorgsky, who lots of people have heard of, Rimsky-Korsakov, and Alexander Borodin. These are composers that sort of existed between Tchaikovsky, although they lived at the same time as he did, between Tchaikovsky and the modern Russians that we know so well, like Shostakovich and Igor Stravinsky.
So where does he fit within the eras of classical music?
He fits squarely in what I would call the camp of nationalism. And this is not rah-rah, flag-waving kind of nationalism. That's really the way that term gets defined today. It's not some kind of applied patina to folk music or something along those lines. This is the real folk music, the real folk spirit songs, dances, and religious music of a people, of a cultural group in Russia. And the five, as they were known in that time, as well as our own, they were really wedded to this concept of nationalism, and that music should come from the culture of the people who live in the place where it was composed.
So how does what they're drawing on get reflected in the music?
It's a little bit vague and hard to describe. And as I said a moment ago, it's not the situation where they just take a folk tune and then dress it up a little bit and now it's nationalism. It's more profound than that. The nationalist composers in Russia often didn't quote source material directly. They weren't just like getting a folk song and turning it into an orchestra piece. Instead, they were sort of borrowing from a whole cultural ethos. You know, it was these Russian composers that first made an aesthetic out of nationalism. Music had been dominated in Russia and everywhere else by the Italians up until this point. Mm-hmm. Opera in Moscow in the 1800s meant Italian opera, and Russia came very late into the classical musical world, if that's what you want to call it. As late as 1850, there was not a single music conservatory in all of Russia. And I'm not bashing them for that. It's just this curious thing. Mm-hmm. What it really means is that if you like Russian music, you like modern music in a way, because they were so late to the game. Almost everything can be described as modernism, just because of the timelines that are involved.
So since classical music was sort of new to Russia at the time, these gentlemen must have been coming from other fields.
Right. There wasn't this pre-existing industry of classical music or being a professional musician that you entered into with training and all those things. Of course, music existed in Russia, but by the 1850s, by Rimsky-Korsakov's time, you really didn't have a full-time career as a professional composer or musician. These five composers, as well as many other composers from the era, they had other jobs. Rimsky-Korsakov was born in 1844. He did eventually become the grand old man of Russian music, but he was in the Navy. He was a naval officer. He eventually ended up teaching at the St. Petersburg Conservatory. Alexander Borodin was a chemist. Mussorgsky had some kind of civil service or military job. These people did a lot of other things, and music was one of their occupations.
Did this impact the way that Rimsky-Korsakov felt he measured up as a composer?
It really did. In some ways, he felt very inadequate, and we know that because he said it himself. I'd like to read a description that he gave when he started teaching at the conservatory. This is from a book by Harold Schoenberg, but it's a direct quote from Rimsky-Korsakov himself. So he's going to teach at the conservatory. It was not merely that I couldn't at that time have harmonized a chorale properly. I had never written a single contrapuntal exercise in my life, and I had only the haziest understanding of strict fugue. But I didn't even know the names of the augmented and diminished intervals or of the chords, other than the tonic triad and the dominant and diminished sevenths. Though I could sing anything at sight and distinguish any conceivable chord, the terms chord of the sixth or 6/4 chord were unknown to me. And so these are the basic building blocks of music theory, and Rimsky-Korsakov didn't know those things when he came to the conservatory. What we end up with is sort of a novice who's a great musician. He doesn't know anything about orchestration when he starts his conservatory work, and yet he ends up being one of the composers that people say has the best skill at orchestration. He's literally thought of as a master in that area, like Maurice Ravel, who came later. And some people say Rimsky-Korsakov created Maurice Ravel because of his skill in orchestrating his work.
So Rimsky-Korsakov also worked as a teacher. How did he approach that work?
He approached it as a workman. He remained in the Navy during the time he was teaching at the conservatory. He taught his classes in his Navy uniform. He had to study very hard to keep one step ahead of the students in his classes. This was all sort of new to everyone, this whole idea of having a music conservatory. But he did that. He stayed ahead of them and became a very fine teacher and sort of immersed himself in this life of academia, which, by the way, a lot of other composers, including other members of the Five, thought that he was a renegade who had joined the enemy, that now instead of focusing on Russian culture in the real world, he was in this academic setting and he was ignoring the Russian heritage that he should have been focused on so that he could compose fugues and sonatas and things like that. In fact, Mussorgsky said, "The mighty Five have hatched into a horde of soulless traitors."
Oh, no. Well, I know that Scheherazade is one of my favorite works, but what is it about Rimsky-Korsakov's work that is so broadly appealing?
Well, first of all, it's his skill in orchestrating, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But the Five composers, other people that criticized him and said that he was a traitor and turning his back on these ideas of a cultural ethos, they're wrong. Rimsky-Korsakov was not a traitor. He was not a renegade. In fact, he went into this life of academia and teaching at a conservatory, but he became the most nationalistic composer of all of those guys, even Mussorgsky himself, you might say. He did compose in an academic way, but all of his operas are based on the concepts present in Russian folk heritage. And they have names like The Tsar's Bride and Legend of the Invisible City and The Snow Maiden and things like that. So he stayed true to those nationalistic roots. Going back to orchestration, which was his strong suit, this is the way a composer comes up with how the piece is going to sound. They have some musical ideas, they work them out on the piano or other instruments, they write them out. But to make an orchestra play a piece, you got to decide who's going to do what. And Rimsky-Korsakov was one of the best at that practice, and it was other composers and writers who recognized that in him. Here's a description that Sergei Rachmaninoff, a later famous Russian composer, who also was a very good orchestrator, had to say about Rimsky. In his scores, there is never the slightest doubt about the meteorological picture the music is meant to convey. When there is a snowstorm, the flakes seem to dance and drift from the woodwinds and the sound holes of the violins. When the sun is high, all instruments shine with an almost fiery glare. When there is water, the waves ripple and dance audibly through the orchestra, and this effect is not achieved by the comparatively cheap means of a harp glissando. The sound is cool and glassy when he describes a calm winter night with a glittering starlit sky. He was a great master of orchestral sound painting, and one can still learn from him to this day. It's the orchestration that makes these pieces, like Scheherazade, sound amazing. And by the way, the nationalistic elements weren't just present in the operas. They're in pieces like Scheherazade or Russian Easter. These pieces sound great. They sound amazing, and they're very accessible to the audience. Not because they're simple or dumbed down, but because they sound amazing. Everyone likes them.
So the orchestration is really brilliant, but of course the subject matter is also incredibly enticing.
That's right. So Rimsky-Korsakov based his Scheherazade piece on 1001 Nights, which is also known as the Arabian Nights. This is some popular literature of the day. There's really two things that propel the popularity of Scheherazade. The orchestration we've talked about, and then also this interest that Russian people at the time had in the East. This music is based on the Arabian Nights, which is really kind of a fantastical set of narratives from the Orient. And this was very big for Russian composers, not just Rimsky-Korsakov. You can hear it very readily in the music of Prokofiev and Shostakovich. People kept doing this for 100 years, in incorporating gongs or Asian instruments or Eastern-sounding themes. But Rimsky-Korsakov was among the first to focus on that part of this culture in such a way.
So being based upon the 1001 Nights, is there a specific program, as in a romantic piece of music?
Yes and no. So this is not really considered part of Romanticism writ large. And the reason for that is the basing of the music on this Eastern theme is not done in a super specific way. So when this piece was first composed by Rimsky-Korsakov, the names of the four movements were Prelude, Ballade, Adagio, and Finale. Much more abstract titles. But later he added in thematic headings to each movement, and they were based on concepts or themes from the Arabian Nights. But they were very vague. They were not specifically associated with the tales of Sinbad or anything else like that. And in a later, maybe the final edition of this work, Rimsky-Korsakov did away with the titles altogether, desiring only that the listener would hear this work as an Oriental-themed symphonic music that would evoke a sense of the fairy tale adventure. And he explained himself by saying, "All I desired was that the hearer, if he liked my piece as symphonic music, should carry away the impression that it is beyond a doubt an Oriental narrative of some numerous and varied fairy tale wonders, and not merely four pieces played one after the other and composed on the basis of themes common to all the four movements." So it's kind of like Romanticism light in the fact that there's no specific attribution of a musical theme to some kind of emotion or idea. It's a little bit more of an abstract way of presenting concepts from another culture. That
being said, though, does it reflect the 1001 Nights?
It does. The story revolves around the Sultan. His name is Shahryar. This Sultan is convinced that all women are false and faithless, and he vowed to put to death every one of his wives after the first nuptial night. Our hero in the story is the Sultana, named Scheherazade, who saves her own life by entertaining the Sultan with fascinating tales. These are told for 1001 nights in succession. And so the Sultan, who was consumed with curiosity, every day had to postpone the execution of his new wife and finally repudiated his bloody vow entirely. So it's not a story that holds up well by modern standards, but it also doesn't follow that narrative or that story too clearly. You can hear Scheherazade dancing and things along those lines, but he wasn't trying to give a verbatim account of what was going on in 1001 Nights as a whole. By the way, the grim bass motif that opens the first movement, that does represent the domineering sultan. So that is a romantic element. Dun, 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 dun. You know who that is as soon as you hear that music.
So as such a popular work, surely other composers have done their own things with Scheherazade.
That's right. Scheherazade is an interesting piece because it's put together like a symphony, has 4 movements, but it's not really a symphony. It's a bit more fun in different ways, and composers have really latched on to that. Many of them have done different things with this type of music. Most famously, Sergei Prokofiev wrote a fantasia on Scheherazade, arranged it for piano, which he recorded on a piano roll or a player piano. So you can actually hear what Prokofiev wanted this music to sound like. A lot of players and composers did this type of thing.
And of course, it's been heard in movies and television over the years.
It comes up all the time. The Song of Scheherazade is a 1947 Universal picture in which the lead actress, a woman named Yvonne DiCarlo, was also the principal dancer, Scheherazade as a ballet. The plot of this film is a very heavily fictionalized story, which incorporates Rimsky-Korsakov's early career in the Navy and a bunch of other things. But it's called The Song of Scheherazade, and the music is there for you. In the film Invitation to the Dance by Gene Kelly, Scheherazade is used as dance music in the third story of the film. There's a few different tales that are presented in this movie. There's an animated segment, which is called Sinbad the Sailor, and that uses the music of Scheherazade. Fritz Kreisler arranged the second movement, which sometimes is called the story of the Calendar Prince, as well as the third movement for violin and piano, giving these arrangements names like Dance Orientale and Chanson Arabe, respectively. And then another interesting use of this music in 1959, a big band leader in the United States named Skip Martin adapted from Scheherazade the jazz album Scheherazade. This is on Somerset Records. I happen to own this record. I wish I could say that it was a masterpiece, but really what it sounds like is a recording of the NBC orchestra playing Scheherazade, and then it fades out really quickly, and this big band kind of comes in like that, and then it goes back to the orchestra. It doesn't even sound like these musicians ever played together. It's like this back and forth thing. Scheherazade. It's kind of a novelty record. There's also a Prince Igor record and something called Gershwin with bongos, and I have those records as well.
Well, I am so delighted that the VSO is returning to this beautiful piece, and it will be a delight to hear it.
I can't wait. We played it maybe 10 years ago. I'm not really sure, and I'm glad it's come back around.
So a rather long-awaited piece on this program is Xavier Monsalvage's Concerto Capriccio for Harp and Orchestra.
This is a new composer for us. Monsalvage was a Spanish composer and music critic. He's a contemporary musician. He died in Barcelona in 2002.
What can you tell me about Monsalvage's career?
Well, it was very versatile. He was a very versatile composer, and by that I mean he, more than most other contemporary composers, went through some very marked, distinct phases of his career and the things that he tried to do when he was writing. And the first one of those was 12-tone serialism, which was very in vogue in the first half of the 20th century. This 12-tone serialism is a kind of music where composers decided, since there's 12 pitches, they can be played in different octaves, but there's 12 notes in Western music. And they made up some rules around those, such as if you write down one note in your composition, you can't use that one again until you use the other 11. And this really blew up into beyond individual notes. They started doing it with rhythm. They started doing it with dynamics. Like you can't play that soft level again until you do these other dynamic levels. And serialism was very popular and influenced all of 20th century music. It's discordant at times. It sounds unusual and weird to our ears. But this dominated the musical scene in Catalan, which is where Mons Salvatge was working at the time. There was also some Wagnerism, which is romantic music, which is a strange influence to combine with serialism. But these were the things that shaped his music in that first phase.
So what came next for him?
Well, next he kind of took a left turn and he found inspiration in the music of the Antilles region. Antilles is an archipelago that is bordered by the Caribbean Sea to the south and west, and the Gulf of Mexico to the northwest, and the Atlantic Ocean to the north and east. This isolated region has a very unique tonality and sounds which interested Mons Salvatge very greatly, and so he had that as the guiding principle in his music and didn't compose 12-tone or serialized music anymore.
So he didn't stay in that phase either. What came after that?
No, after that he jumped ship and started really focusing on some French composers, including Olivier Messiaen, and this led to free polytonality, which was the stage that came next for him. Polytonality is the musical use of more than one key simultaneously. So in traditional music, if you're playing a piece of music, it's going to be in the key of C major or D minor or whatever it is. That's what really sets the tonality of the piece. Mons Salvatge became very interested in the practice of having multiple keys being used simultaneously, which can be very dissonant at times and very bracing. He didn't invent this. This came into vogue during Stravinsky's time. There are places in Stravinsky's music where you have, for instance, a C and an F sharp major chord being played simultaneously. In fact, that specific chord is called the Petrushka chord because Stravinsky wrote it in that piece. And it can sound like kind of mashing your hands down on a piano keyboard if you do the voicings right. This was kind of the hallmark of polytonality.
So polytonality, is that the same as bitonality?
So polytonality is using more than two keys at the same time. Bitonality is the use of only two different key signatures at the same time. Sometimes bitonality can use melodies from different key signatures, but also fully harmonized melodies. So it can really get to sounding very thick. This makes us think that the music must be modern and weird. But bitonality has been around since way before Stravinsky's time, if you think of it in a certain way. For instance, there are Bach pieces where there's counterpoint, and sometimes Bach would take one of the melodies and keep it in a key signature that didn't really make much sense compared with the other melody. In other words, when he wrote counterpoint, he would change things so that the competing melodies were in the same key. But once in a while, he didn't do that. And so you'd have a couple melodies going along at the same time, and you'd have some dissonance there. Mozart did it as well. He wrote a piece called A Musical Joke, where bitonality exists, and I'm sure during his time people thought it was funny because it sounded like wrong notes. But these early Baroque and classical composers were experimenting with bitonality. 200 years later, people are still doing it.
So what was the final phase of Mons Salvatge's career?
Lastly, he ended up in the avant-garde, which is probably difficult to explain other than saying it can be almost anything as long as it's anti-establishment. So if you're doing something that people frown upon and has never been done before, and they think it breaks the rules, and they think it's wrong and shouldn't be done, well, that's the avant-garde.
What kinds of musical forms did Mons Salvatge write in?
His music sounds pretty futuristic, but the forms are more or less based on traditional concepts. He wrote operas, he wrote chamber music, he wrote orchestral works. In 1975, he wrote this concert capriccio for harp and orchestra. It's a very, very delightful and unusual piece. I was listening to the recording of it because I couldn't figure out how some of the passages in the trombone part made sense. Mm-hmm. And it is wild music. It's going to be very fun to listen to this piece be performed. By the way, he wrote it in this late stage of his career. It incorporates, I think, little pieces from the previous stages that he was in. I'm not sure if there's any serialized music in here. It does sound that way. And I've got to say that this harp piece is one of the most unusual things we've ever played in the Vancouver Symphony. I found it to be amazing.
Yes, it's very exciting. We finally get to hear it. Of course, we were anticipating having this soloist a few years ago, and the scheduling didn't work out. So we're so pleased that she's returning to perform this piece with the VSO.
It's going to be worth the wait.
Thank you so much for tuning in early. Please enjoy the show.